for more on this discussion, we're now joined by Hlumelo Xaba, a public governance expert, and he'll talk to us more about the national dialogue. He joins us now via our video link. Hlumelo, thank you so much for your time this evening here in SABC News. Perhaps let's start off here. I mean, this is something we've heard, that will take place in the country for a number of years, and of course, this for a couple of months now. And this stems from last year's elections when, of course, no party won the majority by 50%, and we find ourselves in a government of national unity. Maybe let's start off here. What should be the key priorities when it comes to this national dialogue?
Good evening, Bali, and thank you very much for having me. Well, as you had also mentioned now, that the national dialogue is something that was proposed last year by the president in the wake of the electoral outcomes, which actually happened last year, and then a government of national unity ended up being formed. So I think part of what should actually constitute a national dialogue, the key priorities rather, of what should constitute a dialogue of this nature are what are actually are the challenges that are actually facing citizens in the country. Because if I actually look, I think it serves me right, because if I actually look at the current state of affairs in the country, and also where at the political juncture we are, you'll realize that the national dialogue, which President Ramaphosa and his cabinet are actually proposing, are actually nuanced with the Freedom Charter, which was actually proposed, or rather adopted in 1955, because we more or less find ourselves in the same juncture as we were in during that period. So I think the key priorities, or rather some of the things that should underpin such a dialogue, are probably things such as service delivery, as well as eradicating poverty and inequality.
And I mean, we saw, when it comes to service delivery matters in this country, this really led to, coalitions, be it in municipalities. And now that we find ourselves in a government of national unity, perhaps maybe if you could also enlighten us, why should South Africans take part in this national dialogue?
Well, I think it's important because part of government's priorities when it comes to legislating acts is ensuring that there is sufficient public participation from all citizens. For instance, I'll make an example with this Section 25 bill, which actually went for a public hearing and then ended up being adopted now as an act, which is now the Contentious Expropriation Act that many political parties are fighting over. So I think some of the things, the reason why it's so important is because citizens get to actually have a view and a perspective on the type of country that they want to have. But then now it's unfortunate that the current government, or rather for the past 30 years, what we've been challenged with as a country is a weak bureaucracy. For instance, what I mean by that is that you'll find people in certain government positions from a local level up until national who don't have the necessary skill as well as the necessary qualifications to implement the policies or whatever work that they need to do in a government level. So that is now an unfortunate thing, because you actually need a very qualified and skilled bureaucracy in order to ensure that you give optimal service delivery to citizens. For instance, you'll find in local government that there are ward councillors that don't even have a post-school qualification, let alone that some of them don't even have a matric. So how do you then expect such people to carry out government work, or to rather implement legislations that have been cascaded down from a national level? So I think the main reason why we need citizen participation is because we need to reflect thoroughly and actually be able to contribute towards the discourse of the country nationally, provincially, and locally.
And what makes this sort of a national dialogue different as opposed to when we found ourselves being ruled by one party that found the majority through the ballot?
I think now, like I did mention previously, that the juncture that we are in as a country politically does require for different stakeholders, or rather for people who are states, non-state actors, as well as people who are political and non-political actors, to come together in order to carve a way forward. There's actually an article that I wrote last year in regards to coalition governments, where I actually mentioned that political parties should actually not impose their own views when it comes to ensuring that there's optimal service delivery in the country. So I think currently, that's the juncture that we find ourselves in as a country, and what we are currently seeing now ensuing at a national level, for instance, with the Expropriation Act, is exactly what I had actually warned about, to say that we need people to actually refrain from actually wanting their views to be implemented, or their policies to be implemented in government. But we need a government that is actually going to have a diagnosis of what is happening on the ground. Because what I actually embraced about President Ramaphosa's approach yesterday in regards to this is that the national dialogue has a very broad and ground up approach, as opposed to something that is arbitrary, which is coming from the top and to the bottom. So I think the most important thing in this case would actually be to ensure that there is maximum participation from citizens, and that you actually get skilled people that are going to drive these policies and their government's agenda in ensuring that there is actually a better country for all.
And Hlumelo, with this national dialogue, I mean, what are your expectations from it, and how do you think it will be handled by this government?
Well, my expectations for this national dialogue, to be honest, is to see a spirit of togetherness, to say the least, because in such an instance, we don't need people, like I did mention, that you don't need people that are going to actually come and want to actually have one stake of the pie, whereas the others now don't actually get to have a say. So I think, like I did mention, that the approach that government is taking with this national dialogue is very important, in that it seeks to amalgamate all sectors of society, be like civil society, as well as like the higher education sector, for that matter, because President Ramaphosa did mention that he wants to include the higher education sector in ensuring that they do give advice in terms of how certain things within that sector, or the education sector as a whole, should function. And also, it did mention the fact that the Public Service Commission should also take a central role in ensuring that we have a strong bureaucracy, because, as I mentioned previously, that we lack a very strong bureaucracy in South Africa. Hence, we find ourselves at the stage we're in terms of policy implementation. So my expectations is that everything that was mentioned yesterday in the Sonia speech actually does transpire, because, to be honest, as cliche as it might sound, but the ANC government, because this is also an ANC-led coalition, because the ANC is actually the largest party within that coalition, the ANC has actually, some of the reasons why the ANC has failed in implementing its policies is because of the fact that they didn't have a strong bureaucracy. So my expectation is that the implementation of everything, once everything has actually been discussed within the national dialogue, will actually get implemented in ensuring that there is actually an agenda that is driven by the government from a local level up until the national level. So really my expectation is that everything that people are going to be discussing, or rather this discourse, will actually have optimal outcomes for the citizens.
Hlumelo, thank you so much for your time this evening. That is Hlumelo Xaba. He is a public governance expert talking to us there about the national dialogue, which is expected to take place this year. Of course, discussing ways in which the country will govern, particularly now that we find ourselves in a national government of national unity, rather.